So there's this quote sitting right on the very first page of our organizational behavior textbook source today, and it honestly just stopped me dead in my tracks.
Oh, I know exactly the one you're talking about.
Yeah, it says, if we eventually destroy this planet, the underlying cause will not be technology or weaponry. We will have destroyed it with ineffective organizations.
It's a heavy way to start a textbook, right?
It really is. I mean,
Yeah.
we spend so much time, worrying about rogue AI or like nuclear arsenals or asteroid strikes. But this material is basically arguing that the main threat to human survival isn't our technology.
Right. It's our absolute inability to structure how we actually work together.
Exactly. And that brings us to the core of today's deep dive. Because in 2010, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig didn't explode, killing 11 men and spilling, 230 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico, just because a single pipe happened to fail.
No, not at all. It exploded because, well, human psychology, flawed management systems, and just these extreme economic pressures created this perfect invisible storm long before the first spark even ignited.
Right. So whether you're, prepping for a massive management restructuring or trying to decode the toxic culture of your own office, or you're just insanely curious about how massive multi-billion-dollar systems operate and fail, you're in the right place.
Definitely.
Because our mission today is to unpack this monumental question using our sources on organizational behavior and the psychology of learning theories. Like, how does a disaster of this scale perfectly map onto human conditioning and corporate hierarchy?
And the scale of this failure is really what makes it such a terrifyingly perfect case study. I mean, we're taking highly abstract concepts, things like operant conditioning, political systems within corporations, the macro environment, and watching them manifest in a deeply physical, violent reality.
Yeah, it's not just theory anymore.
Exactly. The major man-made disasters of the last century, from Bhopal to Chernobyl, the Space Shuttle Challenger, and obviously the Macondo Well blowout on the Deepwater Horizon, they all share this exact same DNA.
Wow. So it's a pattern.
Right. The postmortem investigations inevitably trace the root cause back to organizational and management factors. We're looking at broken systems of human interaction that physically broke steel and concrete.
That is just, it's wild to think about because the public narrative is almost always simplified, isn't it? Like when you
Yeah.
hear about an oil rig exploding, your immediate reaction is, oh, someone pushed the wrong button or a valve rusted out.
Yeah, we want a simple mechanical excuse.
But our sources make it abundantly clear that this wasn't some sudden, unpredictable technological glitch. It was a total failure of the OB field map.
Right.
And for you listening, the OB field map is this core concept in organizational behavior. Just imagine a series of concentric circles. At the very center, you have the individual employee, right?
Enclosing them is the group or the team.
Right, and enclosing the team is the organization's structural hierarchy. And then encompassing all of that, like this massive outermost layer pressing inward on everything else, is the external environment.
Yeah, and our text refers to that outer layer using the acronym PESTLE, P-E-S-T-L-E.
Let's break that down. What does that stand for?
So it stands for the political, economic, social, technological, legal, and ecological context in which any organization operates.
Okay, so it's basically everything outside the company's walls.
Exactly. And you cannot understand why an individual worker on a drill floor makes a fatal decision at, say, 9:00 p.m. without first understanding the immense pestle pressures squeezing the entire corporate entity from the outside.
The external environment dictates the internal reality.
100%.
Okay, let's ground this in the physical reality of April 2010. BP is the operator of the Macondo Well in the Gulf of Mexico. But they don't actually own the drilling rig, do they?
No, they're leasing it. They lease this massive 33,000-ton floating platform called the Deepwater Horizon from a specialized company called Transocean.
Right. And to understand those pestle pressures, we really have to look at the numbers because BP paid $34 million just for the lease to drill in this specific geographic block.
Yeah, that's just to get their foot in the door.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they were expecting to tap into a reservoir holding at least 50 million barrels of oil. But they are operating in an incredibly hostile environment.
Right, and the sheer physics of what they were attempting is mind-boggling. which feeds directly into the economic and technological aspects of that pestle map.
How so?
Well, economically, global demand for hydrocarbons was driving companies to push the boundaries of where they could drill. I mean, they were no longer just drilling in shallow coastal water.
Right, they were way out there.
Yeah, the Deepwater Horizon was floating in water a mile deep, and then from the ocean floor, they were drilling another 3 miles into the Earth's crust.
A mile of water and 3 miles of rock. That is, I can't even wrap my head around that.
It's insane. At that depth, the technological requirements are staggering. You're dealing with temperatures near freezing at the seafloor and then incredibly high temperatures down in the well, alongside just crushing pressures. And the technology to physically reach the oil had evolved so rapidly, but, and this is the critical tension our sources highlight, that extraction technology was radically outpacing the human management structures required to deploy it safely.
Because they built the machine before they figured out how to safely manage the humans running it.
Exactly.
And the financial weight pressing down on this specific project was just suffocating. I mean, by April 2010, the crew openly referred to Macondo as the well from hell.
Yeah, everything that could go wrong had gone wrong.
Right. They were 6 weeks behind schedule. They were $58 million over budget. And leasing that rig from Transocean, plus all the subcontractors and logistics, was costing BP $1 million every single day.
$1 million a day. Just let that sink in.
Right. Imagine trying to make a rational, safety-focused decision when a ticking clock above your head is charging your employer $1 million for every 24 hours of delay.
It's almost impossible. And that economic furnace intersects dangerously with the political and legal layers of our pestle map.
Oh, right, the regulators.
Yeah. In any high-stakes, hazardous industry, you rely on a regulatory body to act as a counterweight to that economic pressure. You need a referee to say, look, I don't care how much money you're losing, you cannot cut this safety corner.
And for offshore drilling in the U.S. at that time, the referee was the Minerals Management Service, or MMS. But our OB textbook points out a fatal structural contradiction in their legal mandate.
Right. Their goals were entirely at war with themselves.
It's almost comical how badly designed this agency was. So they were tasked with auditing safety and enforcing environmental protection, right?
Yes.
But their other mandate was to maximize revenues from the leases and royalties that the oil companies paid to the government.
Yeah, the conflict of interest is just staggering. I mean, in 2008 alone, the MMS collected $23 billion in revenues.
$23 billion.
Right. It is virtually impossible for a regulatory body to aggressively police the exact same industry that it relies on to fund the government to the tune of $23 billion. The agency becomes completely captured by the industry it's supposed to regulate.
Right, they're not going to buck the hand that feeds them that much cash.
Exactly. And furthermore, the sources indicate that the regulatory framework simply hadn't kept pace with deep water technology. The MMS staff largely lacked the highly specialized engineering training to even evaluate the specific novel risks of a mega project like Macondo.
So they didn't even understand the machines they were regulating.
Basically, yeah. They were outgunned intellectually and financially, and they lacked the political power to enforce the outdated rules they did have.
Wow.
So the outer pestle layer of our map is inherently compromised, the economic accelerator is mashed to the floor, and the legal and political brakes have essentially been disconnected.
Okay, but I have to push back here for a second because this is where the conversation usually stops in the mainstream media.
Yeah.
We look at the $1 million a day, we look at the compromised regulators, and we say, okay, corporate greed caused this.
Right, that's the standard narrative.
Yet we point the finger at a few executives in London or Houston and write them off as bad apples who valued money over human life. Isn't this just a simple story of villainy?
Well, that is the most natural human instinct in the world, and it's precisely what organizational behavior warns us against. The textbook introduces a foundational psychological concept right here called the fundamental attribution error.
And if you take nothing else away from this deep dive, understand this error. I find it endlessly fascinating because, well, we all do it every single day, mostly without realizing it.
We really do. So the fundamental attribution error is our deep-seated cognitive bias to explain the behavior of other people based on their internal personality or disposition, while completely ignoring the massive contextual and environmental factors that are actually driving their behavior.
Like when someone cuts you off in traffic.
Perfect example. Someone cuts you off and your immediate thought is, that person is a selfish jerk. You attribute their action to a flawed character. You don't consider that maybe they are rushing a sick child to the hospital and environmental pressure.
Right. But when we cut someone off in traffic, We instantly justify it based on our environment. We're like, oh, I'm late for a crucial meeting. I had no choice. I'm normally a very safe driver.
Exactly the mechanism. But when you apply it to corporate structures, it becomes lethal.
How so?
Because if we look at the Macondo blowout and just say that manager was greedy, we commit the fundamental attribution error. We fire the quote-unquote greedy manager and pat ourselves on the back.
Problem solved. Right.
Right. But we leave the $1 million a day pressure, the 6-week delay, and the weak regulatory environment entirely intact. What happens next?
The next manager steps in and does the exact same thing.
Precisely. The next manager who steps into that role is subjected to the exact same pestle pressures and will predictably make the exact same catastrophic decision.
Because the system forces them to.
Yeah. The fundamental attribution error blinds us to systemic risk because our brains prefer simple narratives with clear villains over complex narratives about broken systems.
That makes total sense. So to truly dissect this disaster, we have to look past the illusion of villains and move one layer deeper into our OB field map. We have to examine the internal structure and leadership processes of the organizations involved.
Yes, and this dives into a very uncomfortable truth about corporate lives.
Oh, I love this part. Because when you get hired by a massive corporation, they hand you this glossy orientation pamphlet that basically says, welcome aboard. We are one big happy family. We all share the exact same corporate mission.
Yeah, they frame the company as a unified organism with a single brain.
Right.
But the happy family narrative is one of the most persistent myths in modern business. The organizational behavior literature dismantles this really efficiently. It states a fundamental rule. Organizations do not have goals. Only people have goals.
Wow. That distinction completely reframes how you look at a company.
It forces you to see reality. The thousands of members of an organization might collectively be engaged in, drilling for oil, but individually they are pursuing vastly different personal objectives.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, a senior executive wants a quarterly profit bump to trigger a stock option payout. A middle manager wants to hit a schedule metric to secure a promotion. A third-party contractor just wants to finish the job quickly to secure the next bid.
And a roustabout on the drill floor just wants to finish an exhausting 12-hour shift and go to sleep.
Exactly. Senior leadership routinely drafts mission statements and pretends they're universal truths, but those are still just the goals of the specific individuals who occupy the C-suite.
Okay, so if an organization isn't a family, and it isn't a single organism with one goal, what actually is it?
The sources define organizations as political systems.
Political systems?
Yeah, there are social arrangements where specific individuals exert control over others, primarily through a rigid hierarchy of authority. The power to define the purpose of the work and the power to dictate how it's done is deeply asymmetrical.
Meaning the people at the bottom don't have much say.
Right. Lower-level employees in these political systems are typically presented with the binary choice: comply with the demands of the hierarchy or lose your livelihood.
So let's overlay that political system onto the Deepwater Horizon. Because it wasn't just BP out there in the middle of the ocean. It was a labyrinth of competing corporate entities.
It really was.
BP is the responsible operator. They own the well. But Transocean owns the physical rig and provides the staff to operate the machinery. Then you have Halliburton, this massive service company contracted specifically to pump cement into the wellbore.
Right, so you've got BP site leaders, Transocean tool pushers, Halliburton mud loggers, all answering to different corporate structures with entirely different financial incentives.
It sounds like a logistical powder keg.
It is, and the text points out a catastrophic structural change made by BP in April 2010, the very month of the disaster.
Oh, this is factor number 1 of the 8 management factors that led to the blowout, right? Leadership structure.
Exactly. BP reorganized. They separated their engineering teams from their operations teams, putting them into different reporting silos.
Now, let me play devil's advocate here, because from a purely traditional MBA standpoint, doesn't specialization make sense? Like, why wouldn't you want your design engineers hyper-focused in one silo and your drillers entirely focused on operations in another? You don't want engineers getting distracted by logistics, right?
Well, in a low-risk environment, like, say, manufacturing consumer electronics, that kind of siloed efficiency might increase profit margins. But in a high-risk, volatile environment, what organizational theorists call a high reliability setting, that separation is a death
A
sentence.
death sentence. Why?
Because when you're drilling a mile underwater, the theoretical design of the well and the physical reality of the Earth are in constant, unpredictable conflict. You require what's called tight coupling.
Tight coupling. So they need to be talking constantly.
Yes, the engineers analyzing the geological pressure data must be in constant, frictionless communication with the operators running the drill. By separating them into different reporting structures, BP destroyed a unified, project-based approach.
So the guys designing it weren't talking to the guys building it.
Right. The engineers in Houston, who understood the severe technical risks of this specific well design, were no longer tightly integrated with the operators on the rig who had to physically manage those risks.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the ultimate failure of authority. And there is this deeply illustrative anecdote in the textbook regarding the 2016 movie Deepwater Horizon, directed by Peter Berg.
Oh, yeah, the authors use a specific cinematic moment to explain a really core OB concept.
Right. So in the film, after the blowout has occurred and the rig is literally engulfed in flames, a junior control room operator, a woman who understands the systems intimately, she realizes they need to activate the emergency disconnect to seal the well and stop fueling the fire. But as she reaches for the controls, a male colleague physically restrains her. And the justification he gives isn't that her engineering logic is flawed. He stops her because, quote, "we don't have the authority."
Yeah, that scene is a brilliant distillation of the absence of a crucial concept, deference to expertise.
Deference to expertise.
Right. When we study high reliability organizations, think about a nuclear aircraft carrier, air traffic control, or a hospital emergency room. We see a culture that is explicitly designed to override traditional hierarchy during a crisis.
So they throw the org chart out the window.
Exactly. In a functioning HRO, decision rights are instantly pushed down the chain of command to the person who is closest to the action and possesses the most relevant technical knowledge, regardless of their pay grade or job title.
Like how the guy swabbing the deck on an aircraft carrier can halt flight operations if he sees a loose bolt on the catapult.
Precisely. The system defers to expertise, not authority. But BP and Transocean operated as traditional, rigid political systems. They deferred entirely to authority.
And the textbook draws a chilling historical parallel to illustrate how lethal this is, right? The Piper Alpha disaster in the North Sea in 1988.
Yeah. Piper Alpha is one of the most horrific industrial accidents in history. 167 people burned to death.
And what's crazy is that the mechanical failure on Piper Alpha should not have caused that many deaths.
No, it shouldn't have. An initial explosion sparked a fire, and the rig had firewalls designed to withstand the blaze, and the fire likely would have starved itself of fuel and burned out.
So what went wrong?
Well, Piper Alpha was connected via massive pipelines to two other neighboring oil platforms, and those neighboring platforms continued pumping oil directly into the Piper Alpha fire, feeding it like a blowtorch.
Why on earth wouldn't the neighboring rigs just shut off the flow? It seems so obvious.
Because the managers on those neighboring rigs did not have explicit permission from onshore senior management to halt production. Shutting down production costs massive amounts of money, so they waited for authority.
You're kidding. They just waited.
They watched the glow of Piper Alpha burning on the horizon, and because they deferred to the political hierarchy instead of their own operational expertise, they pumped fuel into the fire until 167 men were dead.
That's just haunting.
It is. And the Deepwater Horizon operated on the exact same flawed organizational logic.
Okay, so we have the immense external pressure of $1 million a day. We have a political hierarchy that demands unquestioning deference to authority, and we have a siloed structure separating the engineers from the operators. Let's move to the next inner ring of the OB field map, the group and individual levels.
Right. Let's look at the ground level.
Yeah, how did this flawed architecture actually translate into physical destruction on the drill floor?
It translated into a total collapse of communication and procedural execution across those subcontractor lines. We know the BP engineering team in Houston was acutely aware that this well design was highly risky.
But because of the silos.
Exactly. Because of the silos, they did not effectively communicate those risks to their own BP site leaders on the rig. And they certainly didn't share them with the Transocean drillers or the Halliburton cementers.
It sounds like a catastrophic college group project,
Yeah.
where everyone assumes the other person is checking the math, but nobody actually is.
That's a perfect analogy. And the textbook outlines a cascade of specific physical signals that were entirely missed or ignored because of this. Let's talk about the cementing, because that is mechanically where this blowout begins.
Right. Halliburton was hired to pump cement down the well. For those listening who aren't petroleum engineers, why is cement so critical?
So, when you drill a hole deep into the earth, you are passing through geological zones containing highly pressurized gas and oil. To prevent that gas from exploding up the wellbore, you pump heavy drilling mud into the hole.
Okay.
The weight of the mud holds the gas down. It's called hydrostatic pressure. But before you can temporarily abandon the well and move the rig away, you have to seal it permanently. You run steel casing pipe down the hole, and then you pump cement down the inside of the pipe so it flows up the outside, filling the space between the steel and the raw rock,
It's like caulking a giant high-pressure window.
basically. And if that cement job is flawed, if it has channels in it, or if it doesn't cure properly, the high-pressure gas from the reservoir will find those cracks and shoot straight up the well like a chimney.
And the sources show that the cementing job was completed, but BP managers decided to skip a critical acoustic evaluation test that would have verified the integrity of the cement seal.
Yeah, skipping it saved time. It saved money. But it blinded them to the fact that the cement had failed.
So they didn't even know they were sitting on a ticking bomb.
Right. And that procedural failure cascaded. Because they didn't know the cement was compromised, they proceeded to conduct pressure tests on the well. The results of those pressure tests were highly anomalous. They clearly indicated a leak.
But they ignored them.
Well, because the crew was pressured by the schedule, and because the communication silos prevented them from seeing the full risk profile, they misinterpreted the abnormal data. They convinced themselves the tests were successful.
Which leads to the most fatal error. They missed the signs of a kick? We need to explain what a kick is in this context.
Right. A kick is the terrifying moment when the pressurized hydrocarbons in the rock formation overcome the downward pressure of your drilling mud, and oil or gas breaches the wellbore and starts traveling up toward the rig.
So the gas is essentially invading the pipe.
Yes. In deep water drilling, detecting a kick early is the single most vital safety objective. If you detect a kick when it's small, you can close valves, pump heavier mud, and kill the well.
And if you miss it.
If you miss the kick, the gas expands as it rises, accelerating violently until it blasts out of the rig floor in a blowout.
But wait, didn't they have an array of multi-million-dollar sensors to monitor for exactly this? I mean, this is a state-of-the-art rig.
They did, which highlights factor 6 from our source text. The flawed reliance on technology. The technology designed to drill the well was light years ahead of the technology designed to monitor its safety.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, the kick detection systems were not automated safety nets. They were complex data displays that relied entirely on human interpretation. The survival of the rig depended on an operator staring at a screen, recognizing a subtle anomaly in mud flow or pressure, and taking immediate action.
And with all the subcontractor silos.
Exactly. Because of the subcontractor dynamics, the responsibility was diffused. A Halliburton mudlogger might notice a weird fluctuation, but feeling the weight of the corporate hierarchy, they deferred to the BP site leader. The political system actively discouraged a contractor from raising a red flag and halting a $1 million a day operation.
So everyone's looking at someone else to pull the alarm. And when the blowout finally happened, the last line of defense failed. The blowout preventer, or BOP.
Yeah, the BOP.
This is a massive 5-story tall stack of valves sitting on the ocean floor. It has a component called a blind shear ram, which is basically a giant hydraulic guillotine designed to slice right through the steel drill pipe and pinch the well completely shut in an emergency.
But it failed to seal the well. It failed because it was improperly maintained, it had exhausted batteries, and the sheer force of the blowout had already bent the drill pipe out of alignment, so the guillotine blades couldn't cut it cleanly. But more importantly, the BOP required human activation in those critical early minutes.
Which brings us to the crux of this entire deep dive. Factor number 4 in the disaster investigation was inadequate training and supervision. The Transocean staff on the drill floor were not adequately trained to interpret the complex pressure tests or effectively monitor for kicks.
Right.
Individuals were making life-and-death decisions without supervisory checks. And this is where I struggle, because these are adults. These are highly skilled, highly compensated professionals operating sophisticated machinery. Why do they fail to execute basic safety protocols?
And that is the ultimate question of organizational behavior. To answer it, we have to move away from the structural diagram of the OB field map and open our second stack of sources, the transcripts detailing the psychological theories of learning.
Okay, so moving from structure to psychology.
Yes. We know the organizational structure was flawed, but we need to understand the biological and cognitive mechanics of how human beings inside that structure actually acquire their behaviors.
Okay, let's lay the groundwork. What exactly is the scientific definition of learning? Our sources provide a definition from Stephen Robbins, a prominent theorist.
Right. So Robbins defines learning as any relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience.
Relatively permanent change in behavior.
Yes. It's an internal, intangible process. You cannot crack open a skull and watch a brain learn. You can only deduce that learning has occurred by observing a relatively permanent change in the person's external behavior.
I want to pause the narrative right here because as I was cross-referencing our sources, I found a glaring, direct contradiction between the two management lectures regarding this exact definition. And I think exploring this contradiction is a perfect exercise in critical thinking for everyone listening.
Oh, I love when sources collide. It forces us to really interrogate the material rather than just accepting it passively. So what is the contradiction?
Okay, so source one, the video lecture from Easy MBA, is trying to explain the difference between instant learning and experiential learning. They say, if a dog chases you, you instantly learn to run.
It makes sense.
Then they say, let's say, for example, a child learns to walk. It doesn't happen instantly. It happens over a period of time. He falls down, and then he learns to walk. So source one uses a child learning to walk as the quintessential example of experiential learning.
Understood.
But then I turn to source two, the study management lecture. They're establishing the strict psychological rules for what constitutes learning. They explicitly state, learning is not caused by biological maturation.
Ah.
And what if their prime example? They say, for example, a child does not learn to walk. It is a natural biological phenomenon. One source says walking is the ultimate example of learning. The other source says walking unequivocally does not count as learning.
That is a brilliant catch, and it cuts to the absolute core of what organizational learning requires. In the strict context of psychology and organizational behavior, source two is the correct framework.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of why.
Well, a human child walking is a developmental milestone pre-programmed by genetics. Yes, there is some trial and error, but the underlying driver is biological maturation. The muscles develop, the nervous system myelinates, and the child walks. It will unfold naturally as the organism matures.
You don't have to put a toddler in a seminar room with a PowerPoint presentation to teach them to walk.
Exactly the point. But within an organization, complex safety behaviors like understanding the fluid dynamics of a hydrostatic pressure test on a deepwater oil rig do not unfold naturally through biological maturation.
You will not naturally evolve into a competent petroleum engineer just by standing on a rig for 5 years.
Right. It requires deliberate, structured experience, feedback, and consequence. If a corporation treats organizational learning like a biological phenomenon, if they assume their workforce will just, naturally absorb a culture of safety over time without rigorous, deliberate conditioning, you end up with factor 4 of the Macondo disaster: inadequate training. True organizational learning requires a deliberate mechanism.
So what are those actual mechanisms? If it's not natural biology, how do you forcibly, permanently change an adult's behavior in a high-stress, million-dollar-a-day environment?
This leads us into the behavioristic theories of learning, beginning with perhaps the most famous and controversial framework in 20th century psychology, operant conditioning, developed by B.F. Skinner.
Ah, Skinner and the infamous Skinner box.
Yes, the premise of operant conditioning is brutally simple. Behavior is determined by its consequences. We learn through a system of reward and punishment.
So how did he prove this?
To prove this, Skinner designed a specialized operant conditioning chamber, widely known as a Skinner box. He would place a deprived, hungry rat inside. The box contained a lever, a green light, a red light, and an electrified floor grid.
Okay, sounds like a torture chamber. So the rat is exploring the box. How does the conditioning actually happen?
Through random trial and error, the rat eventually bumps into the lever. If the green light is on when the lever is pressed, a food pellet drops into a tray. That is a reward. The rat is satisfied. However, if the rat presses the lever when the red light is on, the floor grid delivers a mild, painful electric shock. That is a punishment. Over a series of trials, the rat's behavior undergoes a relatively permanent change.
It learns the rules.
Exactly. It learns to press the lever furiously when the green light is on and to avoid the lever entirely when the red light is on. The consequences have physically conditioned the behavior.
Now, the sources break this theory down into 4 distinct quadrants, and we really need to define these clearly because the psychological terms use words very differently than we do in everyday conversation.
They do. It can be confusing.
We have positive and negative reinforcement, and positive and negative punishment. Let's establish the rules. In operant conditioning, the word positive does not mean good, does it?
It does not. Positive simply means you are adding a stimulus to the environment. Negative means you are removing a stimulus.
Okay. And the other two?
Reinforcement means your goal is to increase or strengthen a specific behavior. Punishment means your goal is to decrease or extinguish a behavior.
Okay, let's run through some everyday examples to cement this before we apply it to the oil rig.
Mm-hmm.
Positive reinforcement. You add something desirable to increase a behavior. So a child completes their chores, you give them $10. You added money to increase the chore-doing behavior.
Correct. Negative reinforcement is trickier for people to grasp. You remove something unpleasant in order to increase a desired behavior.
Like what?
Imagine driving a car. You take off your seatbelt, and the car starts blaring a loud, annoying chime. The chime is terrible. You plug the seatbelt back in, and the annoying chime stops. The car manufacturer has negatively reinforced the behavior of wearing a seatbelt by removing the agonizing sound when you comply.
That makes total sense. Then we move to punishment, which is designed to stop a behavior. Positive punishment is adding an unpleasant stimulus.
Oh.
Say, a teenager breaks curfew, so the parent adds extra grueling chores to their weekend. You added a bad thing to snake the late-night behavior.
And finally, negative punishment, which is removing something desirable to stop a behavior. A child throws a tantrum, so you take away their iPad. You removed a highly desired object to extinguish the tantrum behavior.
Okay, we have the mechanics. Now let's take B.F. Skinner's rat and drop it onto the Deepwater Horizon. How does a rat in a box with a green light explain a catastrophic blowout in the Gulf of Mexico?
Well, we have to view the entire corporate structure of BP, Transocean, and Halliburton as a massive floating Skinner box. Remember the macro pestle environment? They are 6 weeks behind and hemorrhaging $1 million a day. BP management essentially wired the rig to deliver very specific food pellets and electric shocks.
What specific behaviors was management reinforcing?
They were exclusively reinforcing speed. Saving time equaled saving money. If a Transocean driller figured out a way to drill faster, or if a site leader justified skipping a time-consuming cement evaluation, they saved the company $1 million.
So what was the consequence?
Positive reinforcement. They received massive financial bonuses. They received public praise. They were marked as top performers on an expedited track for promotion. The green light was constantly illuminated for anyone willing to cut a corner.
Wow. And what was the consequence for prioritizing safety?
Safety, by its very physical nature, almost always requires slowing down. If an engineer looks at a questionable pressure test and says, I'm not comfortable with this, I need to halt operations for 24 hours to rerun the diagnostics, that decision instantly costs BP $1 million.
So how does the political hierarchy respond?
Negative punishment. That engineer will likely lose their performance bonus. They might lose their status. In a contractor scenario, Halliburton might lose their bid for the next lucrative drilling contract.
So the shock.
Yes. The red light flashed brightly, threatening financial and professional shock every single time an employee prioritized safety over speed.
So the fundamental attribution error makes the public look at this disaster and say, oh, those workers were reckless, greedy individuals. But operant conditioning forces us to realize, wait, those workers were perfectly rationally conditioned.
Exactly. They didn't fail to learn. They learned exactly what the organizational environment trained them to value. Speed brings food pellets. Safety brings electric shocks.
It's a really dark realization. They acted rationally within a toxic reward system.
It is. But operant conditioning is only one half of the behavioral puzzle. Operant conditioning deals with voluntary conscious behaviors, choosing to press the lever. But what about our involuntary reflexive behaviors?
Right, the stuff we don't even think about.
Exactly. To understand why the crew missed the physical warning signs on the day of the disaster, we have to look at Ivan Pavlov and classical conditioning.
Pavlov's dogs. This is the psychological study almost everyone is familiar with. You ring a bell, the dog starts drooling. But let's dive into the biological mechanics of how this works, based on the Easy MBA lecture source, because it explains how human brains can be rewired to link entirely unrelated things together.
So Pavlov, who was a Russian physiologist, started his experiment with a dog and a bowl of meat powder. The meat powder is what we call an unconditioned stimulus. It naturally, biologically, triggers a reflex without any prior learning.
You put meat in front of a dog, it salivates.
Right. The salivation is the unconditioned response. It's hardwired into the animal's nervous system.
Then Pavlov introduces a totally neutral stimulus into the environment, the sound of a bell. If you just walk up to a dog and ring a bell, it might tilt its head, but it doesn't drool. The bell has no biological meaning.
But then the conditioning phase begins. Pavlov rings the bell, and a fraction of a second later, he presents the meat powder. Bell, then meat. Bell, then meat. He repeats this pairing dozens of times.
And what happens in the dog's brain?
The dog's brain begins to forge a physical neural pathway, linking the auditory sound of the bell to the biological expectation of food.
And then comes the crucial test. Pavlov takes the meat powder away entirely. He simply rings the bell.
And the dog salivates profusely. The neutral bell has now transformed into a conditioned stimulus, and the salivation, triggered merely by a sound, is a conditioned response. The animal's nervous system has been hijacked to react physically to something that has no actual nutritional value.
Our video source provides a surprisingly excellent practical example of how this applies to a human workforce. Imagine a large manufacturing factory. Out of nowhere, local management orders an intense facility-wide deep cleaning.
Right, everyone's scrubbing.
Yeah, every machine is scrubbed, floors are polished, and the very next day, the vice president of the entire corporation arrives unannounced for a surprise inspection.
High stress.
Because a powerful executive is suddenly walking the floor, the workers naturally experience an adrenaline spike. They put on their best safety gear, they stop chatting, and they work at maximum efficiency. The vice president's physical presence is the unconditioned stimulus that naturally causes the response of heightened, anxious performance.
Let's follow that conditioning. 3 months later, local management orders another massive, deep cleaning. But this time, the vice president is on a golf course in another state. He isn't coming. What happens to the workforce when they see the mops and floor polishers come out?
Their heart rates spike. They immediately put on their best gear and start working frantically. The deep cleaning, the bell, has been paired with the VP's visit, the meat.
Exactly.
The workers have been classically conditioned. The act of cleaning now subconsciously triggers the physiological response of high-alert performance, regardless of whether the executive actually walks through the door.
This is deeply ingrained subconscious learning. Now, transport that biological mechanism to the control room of the Deepwater Horizon. We established earlier that they miss the signs of a kick, that sudden influx of high-pressure gas that precedes a catastrophic blowout.
Right. And on a modern drilling rig, you are surrounded by an overwhelming array of alarms, sirens, and flashing warning lights monitoring thousands of parameters.
In theory, a blaring alarm should act as an unconditioned stimulus. It should instantly trigger a biological spike of adrenaline, resulting in the unconditioned response of initiating emergency blowout protocols or abandoning the rig.
It absolutely should. But remember the context of the well from hell.
Yeah.
Everything was going wrong for months. Sensors were finicky, equipment was being pushed past its limits.
It is highly probable that alarms were sounding constantly for minor issues, false positives, or pressure fluctuations that were quickly resolved without any catastrophic outcome. They were experiencing what's called alarm fatigue.
Bell, no meat. Bell, no meat. The alarm sounds, but nothing blows up.
Over weeks and months, the crew's physiological response was systematically eroded. They became desensitized. The blaring alarm was no longer subconsciously paired with the immediate threat of a life-ending explosion. It was paired with the annoyance of just another glitch on a delayed, frustrating project.
So they just learned to ignore it.
They were classically conditioned to interpret warning sirens as normal operating background noise. By the time their conscious brains recognized that this specific alarm on April 20th was actually signaling a massive influx of explosive gas, their subconscious reflexes had already cost them the most critical minutes needed to activate the blowout preventer.
That is a terrifying combination. Operant conditioning actively shaped their conscious choices, rewarding them with bonuses for cutting safety corners. And classical conditioning dulled their subconscious biological reflexes to the very alarms designed to save their lives.
It is the definition of a systemic failure. But, as comprehensive as conditioning is, it still feels a bit reductionist, doesn't it? Treating highly educated petroleum engineers merely as rats pressing levers for bonuses or dogs drooling at sirens, it doesn't really capture the full scope of human intelligence.
Yeah, it feels mechanical. It doesn't account for conscious problem solving or the complex ways we interact with our peers.
Which is why our sources transition from behaviorism into the cognitive and social theories of learning. Conditioning explains the subconscious reflexes and the raw pursuit of reward, but we need cognitive learning theory to explain how we process complex information. This brings us to the pioneering work of Wolfgang Kohler.
Kohler and his experiments with chimpanzees.
Yes, Kohler believed that learning wasn't just blindly reacting to stimuli. He wanted to study cognition, the complex internal process where an individual observes their environment, gathers disparate bits of knowledge, and synthesizes them to create an entirely new understanding.
So putting the pieces together.
Exactly. Cognitive learning suggests we actively organize information to solve novel problems.
So instead of a Skinner box, how did Kohler test this cognitive synthesis?
He placed a chimpanzee in a large enclosure. Outside the bars of the enclosure, well out of the animal's reach, he placed a bunch of bananas. Inside the enclosure with the chimpanzee, he left 2 bamboo sticks. However, both sticks were too short on their own to reach the bananas.
Okay, so if the chimpanzee was operating purely on Skinner's operant conditioning, it might just grab a short stick and randomly bang it against the bars, hoping a researcher drops a food pellet as a reward for the action.
Exactly. It would just rely on blind trial and error. But primates possess higher cognitive function. Kohler observed the chimpanzee trying a short stick, realizing it failed, and then retreating. The animal sat and surveyed the environment. It looked at the bananas, it looked at the 2 short sticks, it engaged in cognitive processing.
And what did it do?
Suddenly, the chimpanzee realized that the end of one stick could be wedged into the hollow end of the other. It combined the 2 short sticks to create one long pole and easily reached the bananas. This wasn't repetitive conditioning. It was a sudden internal cognitive leap, an aha moment. The subject synthesized the pieces to solve the puzzle.
Okay, let's apply cognitive learning theory to the Macondo blowout. Why didn't the engineers and operators on the Deepwater Horizon have their aha moment before the gas reached the rig floor? Because they had all the pieces of information.
They did.
They knew they were $58 million over budget. They knew the cement job evaluation was skipped. They had the anomalous pressure readings. They had all the short sticks. Why couldn't they put them together?
They had the sticks, but their cognitive capacity to synthesize that information was systematically dismantled by the organizational structure. Think back to the OB field map and the political hierarchy. BP reorganized and created silos.
Right, the Houston team and the rig team.
The engineers in Houston holding the geological data sticks were structurally separated from the operators on the rig holding the pressure data sticks. Furthermore, cognitive synthesis requires bandwidth.
And they were stressed out of their minds.
The intense, chronic stress of managing a well that is bleeding $1 million a day severely degrades higher-order cognitive function. Add to that the sheer volume of data being presented on complex digital displays. The environment actively prevented the cognitive organization of the risk until it was physically too late.
So they were holding the 2 sticks, but the warning lights were flashing, the alarm fatigue was dulling their senses, their corporate manager was breathing down their neck about the schedule, and the only guy who actually understood how the sticks fit together was in a different reporting silo in Houston.
That is a brutally accurate summary, and it leads us to the final and perhaps most damning piece of our psychological puzzle, social learning theory, developed by Albert Bandura.
Because humans don't just learn in isolated boxes, and we don't just sit alone synthesizing data. We are incredibly social creatures. We constantly look around to see what our peers and our leaders are doing.
We do. Social learning theory asserts that humans learn effectively not just through direct personal experience, but through the observation of others. We model our behavior based on what we see around us, particularly the behavior of those in authority.
All right.
To demonstrate this, Bandura conducted one of the most famous psychological studies of the 20th century, the Bobo doll experiment.
A Bobo doll is one of those large inflatable clown toys with a weighted bottom, right? You punch it, it rocks backward, and then pops right back up to an upright position.
That's the one. Bandura took a group of preschool-aged children and placed them in a playroom. Also in the room was an adult confederate of the researchers. In the first experimental condition, the children simply sat and watched as the adult proceeded to aggressively and physically attack the Bobo doll.
The adult just beat up the doll.
Yeah. The adult punched it, kicked it, hit it with a mallet, and yelled aggressively at it. The children didn't participate, they purely observed. Later, the children were moved to a different room containing toys, including a Bobo doll, and left alone.
What happened?
The children immediately imitated the adult. They exhibited highly aggressive, violent behavior toward the doll, mirroring the exact punches and kicks they had witnessed. They socially learned the violence just by watching a figure of authority perform it.
Wow. And to prove the inverse.
Bandura took a second control group of children. In their playroom, the adult entirely ignored the Bobo doll and engaged in quiet, constructive play with other toys like Tinker Toys. When these children were subsequently left alone with the Bobo doll, they displayed almost no violent behavior toward it. They modeled the constructive, peaceful behavior they had observed.
So the children's behavior was completely dictated by the social model provided by the adult. This theory is absolutely devastating when you apply it to the corporate culture of BP and its subcontractors on the rig. We keep asking how third-party contractors like Transocean drillers, Halliburton cementers, learned that it was culturally acceptable to ignore basic safety protocols.
They learn it socially.
Right. They watched the adults in the room, BP leadership, continually punch the safety Bobo doll.
It is the most profound application of the theory. Go back to Factor 5 of the disaster report. Contractor management. The political system forced the contractors to defer to BP's expertise and authority. When a Halliburton engineer or a Transocean tool pusher watched a senior BP manager make the conscious decision to skip a critical cement evaluation to save a day's rental fee, or watch them accept a clearly compromised pressure test just to stay on budget, they were observing the accepted cultural norms of that specific organization.
BP leadership was actively modeling that cutting corners was not just acceptable. It was the required method for surviving the well from hell. Just like the kids mirroring the violent adult, the entire rig crew socially learned that safety was merely a theoretical concept, while speed was the actual practiced religion of the rig.
Yes, and when you combine that insidious social modeling with the operant conditioning of massive financial bonuses, it is a miracle that complex industrial disasters like this don't happen every single day.
And that realization brings us full circle to the chilling quote that started this entire deep dive. If we eventually destroy this planet, the underlying cause will not be technology. We will have destroyed it with ineffective organizations.
Yeah, the technology didn't wake up on April 20, 2010 and decide to fail in a vacuum. The blowout preventer failed, the cement failed, and the well exploded because an incredibly complex, deeply flawed organizational system systematically conditioned human beings to operate that machinery unsafely.
Let's synthesize all of this for you, the listener, because we have covered a massive expanse of organizational and psychological ground today. The Deepwater Horizon disaster was not caused by a few greedy men, and it wasn't caused by a random bubble in the cement.
Far from it.
Right. When we map this onto the macro-pestle environment, we see a company crushed by the economic pressure of $1 million a day lease, operating under a compromised, conflicted regulatory system that lacked the teeth or the expertise to enforce safety.
And moving inward to the structural level, we see a political hierarchy that reorganized itself into isolated silos, destroying vital communication and demanding absolute deference to authority rather than deference to the engineering expertise on the ground.
And at the absolute center of the map, at the individual psychological level, we find a workforce that was systematically trained for disaster. Operant conditioning rewarded them with status and money for dangerous speed, while implicitly threatening them with punishment for safety delays.
And classical conditioning eroded their biological survival instincts, desensitizing them to the barrage of warning alarms.
While the structural silos actively prevented the cognitive learning required to synthesize the disparate warning signs.
And social learning guaranteed that the reckless, corner-cutting behavior modeled by BP leadership cascaded down to infect every single subcontractor on the rig.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? You are probably not drilling for oil a mile under the surface of the ocean today, but you are absolutely, unequivocally operating within an OB field map in your own life.
Look critically at your own organization tomorrow morning. Are you falling victim to the fundamental attribution error? When a project fails or a colleague makes a catastrophic error, is your immediate instinct to blame their personality? Do you label them as lazy, incompetent, or greedy?
Or are you willing to zoom out and examine the Skinner box of your company's actual reward system?
Right. What behaviors is your senior management actually reinforcing with promotions? What are they punishing? When a crisis hits your office, are you structurally permitted to defer to the person with the most expertise, or does every decision bottleneck at the person with the highest title?
If your company preaches safety, quality, and work-life balance in the HR handbook, but hands the biggest bonuses to the people who work 80-hour weeks and rush buggy products out the door, your organization is punching the Bobo doll. And your team is socially learning exactly what really matters, regardless of what the mission statement says.
The systems we design dictate the behaviors we get. The Macondo blowout is a tragic, extreme, and hypervisible magnification of the exact same organizational dysfunctions and psychological conditioning that dictate behavior in hospitals, massive tech conglomerates, financial institutions, and government agencies every single day.
Which leaves us with a deeply provocative final thought for you to mull over as we wrap up. As we sit here today, major organizations across the globe are rapidly integrating artificial intelligence into their OB field maps. They are deploying AI to manage the exact types of complex data synthesis and structural workflows that the engineers on the Deepwater Horizon were attempting to manage manually.
We're building machines to make the million-dollar-a-day decisions.
We really are. It represents the next massive, unpredictable shift in the technological layer of our PESTLE context.
It absolutely does.
So the ultimate question becomes this. We have just spent the last hour demonstrating how human political hierarchies and flawed human psychological conditioning caused one of the worst environmental disasters in history. Will the artificial intelligence we are building simply inherit our fundamental attribution errors because it is being trained on our historically flawed organizational data?
Oh, will it learn to cut corners because we programmed it in a Skinner box that rewards quarterly profits above all else?
Or will AI be the one entity capable of cutting through the toxic political hierarchy to finally provide true, unbiased deference to expertise? When the data points to disaster, will an AI be able to look a human CEO in the eye and say, I don't care about your budget and I don't care about your authority. We are shutting the well down.
That is the existential organizational question every leader is going to have to answer in the next decade, and the stakes will be infinitely higher than they were in the Gulf of Mexico.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structural hierarchies around you. Keep looking for the invisible Skinner boxes in your own workplace, and we will see you next time.